Hello and welcome to the next reading from It Shouldn't Happen to a Vet by James Herriot. Tonight we read chapters 13, 14 and 15. So we're nearly halfway through the book and we read chapter 13. I was spending Tuesday evening, as I spent all the Tuesday evenings, staring at the back of Helen Alderson's head at the Darrowby Music Society. It was a slow way of getting to know her better, but I had been unable to think of a better idea. Since the morning on the high moor, when I had set the calf's leg, I had scanned the day book regularly in the hope of getting another visit to the farm. Pardon me. But the Aldersons seemed to have lamentably healthy stock. I had to be content with the thought that there was the visit at the month end to take off the plaster. The really crushing blow came when Helen's father rang up to say that since the calf was going sound he had removed the plaster himself. He was pleased to say that the fracture had knitted perfectly and there was no sign of lameness. I had come to admire the self-reliance and initiative of the Dalesman, but I cursed it now at great length, and I joined the music society. I had seen Helen going into the schoolroom where the meetings were held, and with the courage of desperation had followed her inside. That was weeks ago, and, I reflected miserably, I had made no progress at all. I couldn't remember how many tenors, sopranos, and male-voiced choirs had come and gone, and on one occasion the local brass band had packed themselves into the little room and almost burst my eardrums, but I was no further forward. Tonight a string quartet was scraping away industriously, but I hardly heard them. My eyes, as usual, were focused on Helen. Several rows in front of me, sitting between the two old ladies she always seemed to bring with her. That was part of the trouble. These two old girls were always there, cutting out any chance of private conversation, even at the half-time break for tea. And there was the general atmosphere of the place. The members were nearly all elderly, and over everything hung the powerful schoolroom scent of ink and exercise books and chalk and lead pencils. It was the sort of place where you just couldn't say without warning, "Are you doing anything on Saturday night?" The scraping stopped and everybody clapped. The vicar got up from the front row and beamed at the company. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, I think we might stop for 15 minutes as I see our willing helpers have prepared tea. The price, as usual, is 3d." There was laughter and a general pushing back of chairs. I went to the back of the hall with the others, put my 3d on the plate and collected a cup of tea and a biscuit. This was when I tried to get near Helen, in the blind hope that something might happen. It wasn't always easy, because I was often buttonholed by the school headmaster and others who regarded a vet who liked music as an interesting curiosity. But tonight I managed to edge myself as if by accident into her group. She looked at me over the top of her cup. "Good evening, Mr. Herriot. Are you enjoying it?" Oh, God, she always said that. And Mr. Herriot? What could I do? "Call me Jim," would sound great. I replied as always. "Good evening, Miss Alderson. Yes, it's very nice, isn't it?" Things were going with a bang again. I munched my biscuit while the old ladies talked about Mozart. It was going to be the same as all the other Tuesdays. It was about time I gave up the whole thing. I felt beaten. The vicar approached our group, still beaming. "I'm afraid I have to call on somebody for the washing up rota. Perhaps our two young friends would take it on tonight." His friendly gaze twinkled from Helen to me and back again. The idea of washing up teacups had never held much attraction for me, but suddenly it was like sighting the promised land. "Yes, certainly, delighted. That is, if it's all right with Miss Alderson." Helen smiled. "Of course it's all right. We all have to take a turn, don't we?" I wheeled the trolley of cups and saucers into the scullery. It was a cramped, narrow place with a sink and a few shelves, and there was just about room for the two of us to get inside. Would you like to wash or dry? I'll wash, I replied, and began to run the hot water into the sink. It shouldn't be too difficult now, I thought, to work the conversation round to where I wanted it. I'd never have a better chance than now jammed into this little room with Helen. But it was surprising how the time went by. 5 whole minutes and we hadn't talked about anything but music. With mounting frustration, I saw that we had nearly got through the pile of crockery, and I had achieved nothing. The feeling changed to near panic when I lifted the last cup from the soapy water. It had to be now. I held out the cup to Helen, and she tried to take it from me, but I kept a grip on the handle while I waited for inspiration. She pulled gently, but I clung to it tenaciously. It was developing into a tug-of-war. Then I heard a hoarse croak which I only just recognised as my own voice. "Can I see you sometime?" For a moment she didn't answer, and I tried to read her face. Was she surprised, annoyed, even shocked? She flushed and replied, "If you like." I heard the croak again. "Saturday evening?" She nodded, dried the cup, and was gone. I went back to my seat with my heart thudding. The strains of mangled Haydn from the quartet went unheeded. I had done it at last, but did she really want to come out? Had she been hustled into it against her will? My toes curled with embarrassment at the thought, but I consoled myself with the knowledge that, for better or for worse, it was a step forward. Yes, I had done it at last. Chapter 14. As I sat at breakfast, I looked out at the autumn mist dissolving in the early sunshine. It was going to be another fine day, but there was a chill in the old house this morning, a shiveriness as though a cold hand had reached out to remind us that summer had gone and the hard months lay just ahead. "It says here," Siegfried said, adjusting his copy of the Darrowby and Holton Times with care against the coffee pot, "that farmers have no feeling for their animals." I buttered a piece of toast and looked across at him. "Cruel, you mean?" "Well, not exactly, but this chap maintains that to a farmer, livestock are purely commercial. There's no sentiment in his attitude towards them, no affection." Well, it wouldn't do if they were all like poor Kit Bilton, would it? They'd all go mad. Kit was a lorry driver who, like so many of the working men of Darrowby, kept a pig at the bottom of his garden for family consumption. The snag was that when killing time came, Kit wept for 3 days. I happened to go into his house on one of these occasions, and found his wife and daughter hard at it, cutting up the meat for pies and brawn, while Kit huddled miserably by the kitchen fire, his eyes swimming with tears. He was a huge man who could throw a 12-stone sack of meal onto his wagon with a jerk of his arms, but he seized my hand in his and sobbed at me. "I can't bear it, Mr. Herriot. He was like a Christian, was that pig, just like a Christian." "No, I agree." Siegfried leaned over and sawed off a slice of Mrs. Hall's home-baked bread. "But Kit isn't a real farmer. This article is about people who own such large number of animals. The question is it possible for such men to become emotionally involved? Can the dairy farmer milking maybe 50 cows become really fond of any of them, or are they just milk-producing units?" "It's an interesting point," I said, "and I think you've put your finger on it with the numbers. You know there are a lot of our farmers up in the high country who have only a few stock. They always have names for their cows. Daisy, Mabel. I even came across one called Kipperlugs the other day. I do think these small farmers have an affection for their animals, but I don't see how the big men can possibly have." Siegfried rose from the table and stretched luxuriously. "You're probably right. Anyway, I'm sending you to see a really big man this morning. John Skipton of Dennerby Close. He's got some tooth rasping to do. Couple of old horses losing condition. You'd better take all the instruments. It might be anything." I went through to the little room down the passage and surveyed the tooth instruments. I always felt at my most medieval when I was caught up in large animal dentistry, and in the days of the drought horse it was a regular task. One of the commonest jobs was knocking the wolf teeth out of young horses. I have no idea how it got its name, but you found the little wolf tooth just in front of the molars, and if a young horse was doing badly, it always got the blame. It was no good the vets protesting that such a minute vestigial object couldn't possibly have any effect on the horse's health, and that the trouble was probably due to worms. The farmers were adamant the tooth had to be removed. We did this by having the horse backed into a corner, placing the forked end of a metal rod against the tooth, and giving a sharp tap with an absurdly large wooden mallet. Since the tooth had no proper root, the operation was not particularly painful, but the horse still didn't like it. We usually had a couple of forefeet waving around our ears, and the annoying part was that after we had done the job and pointed out to the farmer that we had only performed this bit of black magic to humour him, the horse would take an immediate turn for the better and thrive consistently from then on. Farmers are normally reticent about our successful efforts for fear we might put a bit more on the bill, but in these cases they cast aside all caution. They would shout at us across the marketplace, "Hey, remember that oss you knocked wolf teeth out of? Well, he never looked back. It capped him." I looked again with distaste at the tooth instruments, the vicious forceps with 2 feet long arms, sharp jawed shears, mouth gags, hammers and chisels, files and rasps. It was rather like a quiet corner in the Spanish Inquisition. We kept a long wooden box with a handle for carrying the things, and I staggered out to the car with a fair selection. Denby Close was not just a substantial farm, it was a monument to a man's endurance and skill. The fine old house, the extensive buildings, the great sweep of lush grassland along the lower slopes of the fell were all proof that old John Skipton had achieved the impossible. He had started as an uneducated farm labourer, and he was now a wealthy landowner. The miracle hadn't happened easily. Old John had a lifetime of grinding toil behind him that would have killed most men, a lifetime with no room for a wife or family or creature comforts. But there was more to it than that. There was a brilliant acumen in agricultural matters that had made the old man a legend in the district. "When all world goes one road, I go t'other," was one of his quoted sayings, and it is true that the Skipton farms had made money in the hard times when others were going bankrupt. Denby was only one of John's farms. He had 2 large arable places of about 400 acres each lower down the dale. He had conquered, but to some people it seemed that he had himself been conquered in the process. He had battled against the odds for so many years, and driven himself so fiercely that he couldn't stop. He could be enjoying all kinds of luxuries now, but he just hadn't the time. They said that the poorest of his workers lived in better style than he did. I paused as I got out of the car and stood gazing at the house as though I had never seen it before, and I marvelled again at the elegance which had withstood over 300 years of the harsh climate. People came a long way to see Denby Close and take photographs of the graceful manor, with its tall leaded windows, the massive chimneys towering over the old moss-grown tiles, or to wander through the neglected garden and climb up the sweep of steps to the entrance with its wide stone arch over the great studded door. There should have been a beautiful woman in one of those pointed hats peeping out from that mullioned casement, or a cavalier in ruffles and hose pacing beneath the high wall with its pointed copings. But there was just old John stumping impatiently towards me, his tattered buttonless coat secured only by a length of binder twine round his middle. "Come in a minute, young man," he cried. "I've got a little bill to pay you." He led the way round to the back of the house, and I followed, pondering on the odd fact that it was always a little bill in Yorkshire. We went in through a flagged kitchen to a room which was graceful and spacious, but furnished only with a table a few wooden chairs, and a collapsed sofa. The old man bustled over to the mantelpiece and fished out a bundle of papers from behind the clock. He leafed through them, threw an envelope onto the table, then produced a cheque-book and slapped it down in front of me. I did the usual, took out the bill, made out the amount on the cheque, and pushed it over for him to sign. He wrote with a careful concentration, the small-featured weathered face bent low, the peak of the old cloth cap almost touching the pen. His trousers had ridden up his legs as he sat down, showing the skinny calves and bare ankles. There were no socks underneath the heavy boots. When I had pocketed the cheque, John jumped to his feet. "We'll have to walk down to river. 'Osses are down there." He left the house almost at a trot. I eased my box of instruments from the car boot. It was a funny thing, but whenever I had heavy equipment to lug about, my patients were always a long way away. This box seemed to be filled with lead, and it wasn't going to get any lighter on the journey down through the walled pastures. The old man seized a pitchfork, stabbed it into a bale of hay, and hoisted it effortlessly over his shoulder. He set off again at the same brisk pace. We made our way down from one gateway to another, often walking diagonally across the fields. John didn't reduce speed, and I stumbled after him, puffing a little, and trying to put away the thought that he was at least 50 years older than me. About halfway down we came across a group of men at the age-old task of walling, repairing a gap in one of the dry stone walls which traced their patterns everywhere on the green slopes of the dales. One of the men looked up. "Nice morning, Mr. Skipton," he sang out cheerfully. "Bugger morning. Get on with some work," grunted old John in reply, and the man smiled contentedly as though he had received a compliment. I was glad when we reached the flat land at the bottom. My arms seemed to have been stretched by several inches, and I could feel a trickle of sweat on my brow. Old John appeared unaffected. He flicked the fork from his shoulder, and the bale thudded onto the grass. The two horses turned towards us at the sound. They were standing fetlock deep in the pebbly shallows, just beyond a little beach which merged into the green carpet of turf. Nose to tail, they had been rubbing their chins gently along each other's backs, unconscious of our approach. A high cliff overhanging the far bank made a perfect windbreak, while on either side of us clumps of oak and beech blazed in the autumn sunshine. "They're in a nice spot, Mr. Skipton," I said. "Aye, they can keep cool in the hot weather, and they've got the barn when winter comes." John pointed to a low, thick-walled building with a single door. "They can come and go as they please." The sound of his voice brought the horses out of the river at a stiff trot, and as they came near you could see they really were old. The mare was a chestnut, and the gelding was a light bay, but their coats were so flecked with grey that they almost looked like roans. This was most pronounced on their faces, where the sprinkling of white hairs, the sunken eyes, and the deep cavity above the eyes gave them a truly venerable appearance. For all that, they capered around John with a fair attempt at skittishness, stamping their feet, throwing their heads about, pushing his cap over his eyes with their muzzles. "Get by, leave off," he shouted. "Daft old beggars." But he tugged absently at the mare's forelock and ran his hand briefly along the neck of the gelding. "When did they last do any work?" I asked. "Oh, about 12 years ago, I reckon." I stared at John. 12 years? And have they been down here all that time?" "Aye, just larking about down here, retired like. They've earned it and all." For a few moments he stood silent, shoulders hunched, hands deep in the pockets of his coat. Then he spoke quietly, as if to himself. "They were two slaves when I was a slave." He turned and looked at me, and for a revealing moment I read in the pale blue eyes something of the agony and struggle he had shared with the animals. "But 12 years? How old are they anyway?" John's mouth twisted up at one corner. "Well, you're vet. You tell me." I stepped forward confidently, my mind buzzing with Galvain's groove, shape of marks, degree of slope, and the rest. I grasped the unprotesting upper lip of the mare and looked at her teeth. "Good God!" I gasped. "I've never seen anything like this." The incisors were immensely long and projecting forward till they met at an angle of about 45 degrees. There were no marks at all. They had long since gone. I laughed and turned back to the old man. "It's no good. I'd only be guessing. You'll have to tell me." "Well, she's about 30, and Gelding's a year or two younger. She's had 15 grand foals, and never ailed out except a bit of teeth trouble. We've had them rasped a time or two, and it's time they were done again. I reckon they're both losing ground and dropping bits of half-chewed aid from their mouths. Gelding's the worst, has a right job chumping his grub." I put my hand into the mare's mouth, grasped her tongue, and pulled it out to one side. A quick exploration of the molars with my other hand revealed what I suspected. The outside edges of the upper teeth were overgrown and jagged and were irritating the cheeks, while the inside edges of the lower molars were in a similar state and were slightly excoriating the tongue. "I'll soon make her more comfortable, Mr. Skipton. With those sharp edges rubbed off, she'll be as good as new." I got the rasp out of my vast box, held the tongue in one hand, and worked the rough surface along the teeth, checking occasionally with my fingers till the points had been sufficiently reduced. "That's about right," I said after a few minutes. "I don't want to make them too smooth, or she won't be able to grind her food." John grunted. "Good enough. Now have a look at t'other. There's summat far wrong with him." I had a feel at the gelding's teeth. Just the same as the mare. Soon put him right too. But pushing at the rasp, I had an uncomfortable feeling that something was not quite right. The thing wouldn't go fully to the back of the mouth. Something was stopping it. I stopped rasping and explored again, reaching with my fingers as far as I could. And I came upon something very strange, something which shouldn't have been there at all. It was like a great chunk of bone projecting down from the roof of the mouth. It was time I had a proper look. I got out my pocket torch and shone it over the back of the tongue. It was easy to see the trouble now. The last upper molar was overlapping the lower one, resulting in a gross overgrowth of the posterior border. The result was a sabre-like barb about 3 inches long, stabbing down into the tender tissue of the gum. That would have to come off right now. My jauntiness vanished, and I suppressed a shudder. It meant using the horrible shears. Those great long-handled things with the screw operated by a crossbar. They gave me the willies, because I am one of those people who can't bear to watch anybody blowing up a balloon, and this was the same sort of thing, only worse. You fastened the sharp blades of the shears onto the tooth, and began to turn the bar slowly. Soon the tooth began to groan and creak under the tremendous leverage, and you knew that any second it would break off, and when it did, it was like somebody letting off a rifle in your ear. That was when all hell usually broke loose, but mercifully this was a quiet old horse, and I wouldn't expect him to start dancing around on his hind legs. There was no pain for the horse because the overgrown part had no nerve supply. It was the noise that caused the trouble. Returning to my crate, I produced the dreadful instrument, and with it a houseman's gag, which I inserted on the incisors and opened on its ratchet till the mouth gaped wide. Everything was easy to see then, and of course there it was, a great prong at the other side of the mouth, exactly like the first. Great. Now I had 2 to chop off. The old horse stood patiently, eyes almost closed, as though he had seen it all and nothing in the world was going to bother him. I went through the motions with my toes curling, and when the sharp crack came, the white bordered eyes opened wide, but only in mild surprise. He never even moved. When I did the other side, he paid no attention at all. In fact, with the gag prising his jaws apart, he looked exactly as though he was yawning with boredom. As I bundled the tools away, John picked up the bony spicules from the grass and studied them with interest. "Well, poor old beggar. Good job I got you along, young man. Reckon he'll feel a lot better now." On the way back, old John, relieved of his bale, was able to go twice as fast, and he stumped his way up the hill at a furious pace, using the fork as a staff. I panted along in the rear, changing the box from hand to hand every few minutes. About halfway up, the thing slipped out of my grasp, and it gave me a chance to stop for a breather. As the old man muttered impatiently, I looked back and could just see the two horses. They had returned to the shallows and were playing together, chasing each other jerkily, their feet splashing in the water. The cliff made a dark backcloth to the picture. The shining river, the trees glowing bronze and gold, and the sweet green of the grass. Back in the farmyard, John paused awkwardly. He nodded once or twice, said, "Thank ye, young man," then turned abruptly and walked away. I was dumping the box thankfully into the boot when I saw the man who had spoken to us on the way down. He was sitting, cheerful as ever, in a sunny corner, back against a pile of sacks, pulling his dinner packet from an old army satchel. "You've been down to see pensioners, then? By God! Old John should know the way. Regular visitor, is he?" "Regular. Every day God sends you'll see old fellow plodding down there. Rain, snow or blow, never misses. And always has summat with him. Bag of corn, straw for their bedding." "And he's done that for 12 years? The man unscrewed his thermos flask and poured himself a cup of black tea. "Aye, them osses haven't done a stroke of work all that time, and he could have got good money for them from the horseflesh merchants. Rum 'un, isn't it?" "You're right," I said. "It is a rum 'un." Just how rum it was occupied my thoughts on the way back to the surgery. I went back to my conversation with Siegfried that morning. We had just about decided that the man with a lot of animals couldn't be expected to feel affection for individuals among them, but those buildings back there were full of John Skipton's animals. He must have hundreds. Yet what made him trail down that hillside every day in all weather? Why had he filled the last years of those two old horses with peace and beauty? Why had he given them a final ease and comfort which he had withheld from himself? It could only be love. Chapter 15. The longer I worked in Darrowby, the more the charms of the Dells beguiled me. And there was one solid advantage of which I became more aware every day. The Dells farmers were all stockmen. They really knew how to handle animals, and to a vet whose patients are constantly trying to thwart him or injure him, it was a particular blessing. So this morning I looked with satisfaction at the two men holding the cow. It wasn't a difficult job, just an intravenous injection of magnesium lactate, but still it was reassuring to have two such sturdy fellows to help me. Maurice Benison, medium-sized but as tough as one of his own hill beasts, had a horn in his right hand, while the fingers of his left gripped the nose. I had the comfortable impression that the cow wouldn't jump very far when I pushed the needle in. His brother George, whose job it was to raise the vein, held the choke ropes limply in enormous hands like bunches of carrots. He grinned down at me amiably from his 6 feet 4 inches. "Right, George," I said, "tighten up that rope and lean against the cow to stop her coming round on me." I pushed my way between the cow and her neighbour, past George's unyielding bulk, and bent over the jugular vein. It was standing out very nicely. I poised the needle, feeling the big man's elbow on me as he peered over my shoulder, and thrust quickly into the vein. "Lovely!" I cried as the dark blood fountained out and spattered thickly on the straw bedding beneath. "Slacken your rope, George." I fumbled in my pocket for the flutter valve. "And for God's sake, get your weight off me." Because George had apparently decided to rest his full 14 stones on me instead of the cow, and as I tried desperately to connect the tube to the needle, I felt my knees giving way. I shouted again, despairingly, but he was inert, his chin resting on my shoulder, his breathing stertorous in my ear. There could only be one end to it. I fell flat on my face and lay there writhing under the motionless body. My cries went unheeded. George was unconscious. Mr. Benison, attracted by the commotion, came into the byre just in time to see me crawling out from beneath his eldest son. "Get him out, quick," I gasped, "before the cows trample on him." Wordlessly, Morris and his father took an ankle apiece and hauled away in unison. George shot out from under the cows. His head beat in a brisk tattoo on the cobbles, traversed the dung channel, then resumed his sleep on the byre floor. Mr. Benison moved back to the cow and waited for me to continue with my injection, but I found the presence of the sprawled body distracting. Look, couldn't we sit him up against the wall and put his head between his legs? I suggested apologetically. The others glanced at each other, then, as though deciding to humour me, grabbed George's shoulders and trundled him over the floor with the expertise of men used to throwing around bags of fertiliser and potatoes. But even propped against the rough stones, his head slumped forward, and his great long arms hanging loosely, the poor fellow still didn't look so good. I couldn't help feeling a bit responsible. Don't you think we might give him a drink? But Mr. Benison had had enough. Nay, he'll be right, he muttered testily. Let's get on with job. Evidently he felt he had pampered George too much already. The incident started me thinking about this question of people's reactions to the sight of blood and other disturbing realities. Even though it was only my second year of practice, I had already formulated rules about this, and one was that it was always the biggest men who went down. I had by this time worked out a few other perhaps unscientific theories. For example, big dogs were kept by people who lived in little houses, and vice versa. Clients who said spare no expense never paid their bills ever. When I asked my way in the Dales and was told you can't miss it, I knew I'd soon be hopelessly lost. I had begun to wonder if perhaps country folk, despite their closer contact with fundamental things, were perhaps more susceptible than city people, ever since Sid Blenkhorn had staggered into Skeldale House one evening. His face was ghastly white, and he had obviously passed through a shattering experience. "Have you got a drop of whisky handy, Jim?" he quavered, and when I had guided him to a chair and Siegfried had put a glass in his hand, he told us he had been at a first aid lecture given by Dr. Allinson a few doors down the street. "He was talking about veins and arteries and things," groaned Sid, passing a hand across his forehead. "God, it was awful." Apparently Fred Ellison, the fishmonger, had been carried out unconscious after only 10 minutes, and Sid himself had only just made it to the door. It had been a shambles. I was interested because this sort of thing, I had found, was always just round the corner. I suppose we must have more trouble in this way than the doctors, because in most cases, when our medical colleagues have any cutting or carving to do, they send their patients to hospital, while the vets just have to get their jackets off and operate on the spot. It means that the owners and attendants of the animals are pulled in as helpers, and they are subjected to some unusual sights. So even in my short experience, I had become a fair authority on the various manifestations of coming over queer. I suppose it was a bit early to start compiling statistics, but I had never seen a woman or a little man pass out even though they might exhibit various shadings of the squeamish spectrum. The big chap was the best bet every time, especially the boisterous, super-confident type. I have a vivid recollection of a summer evening when I had to carry out a rumanotomy on a cow. As a rule, I was inclined to play for time when I suspected a foreign body. There were so many other conditions with similar symptoms that I was never in a hurry to make a hole in the animal's side. But this time diagnosis was easy. The sudden fall in milk yield, loss of cuding, grunting, and the rigid sunken-eyed appearance of the cow. And to clinch it, the farmer told me he had been repairing a hen house in the cow pasture, nailing up loose boards. I knew where one of the nails had gone. The farm, right on the main street of the village, was a favourite meeting place for the local lads. As I laid out my instruments on a clean towel draped over a straw bale, a row of grinning faces watched from above the half-door of the box. Not only watched, but encouraged me with ribald shouts. When I was about ready to start, it occurred to me that an extra pair of hands would be helpful, and I turned to the door. "How would one of you lads like to be my assistant?" There was even more shouting for a minute or two, then the door was opened, and a huge young man with a shock of red hair ambled into the box. He was a magnificent sight, with his vast shoulders and the column of sunburned neck rising from the open shirt. It needed only the bright blue eyes and the ruddy, high cheek-boned face to remind me that the Norseman had been around the Dales 1,000 years ago. This was a Viking. I had him roll up his sleeves and scrub his hands in a bucket of warm water and antiseptic, while I infiltrated the cow's flank with local anaesthetic. When I gave him artery forceps and scissors to hold, he pranced around, making stabbing motions at the cow and roaring with laughter. "Maybe you would like to do the job yourself?" I asked. The Viking squared his great shoulders. "I'll have a go," and the heads above the door cheered lustily. As I finally poised my Bard Parker scalpel with its new razor-sharp blade over the cow, the air was thick with earthy witticisms. I had decided that this time I really would make the bold incision recommended in the surgery books. It was about time I advanced beyond the stage of pecking nervously at the skin. A veritable blow was how one learned author had described it. Well, that was how it was going to be. I touched the blade down on the dipped area of the flank, and with a quick motion of the wrist laid open a 10-inch wound. I stood back for a few seconds, admiring the clean-cut edges of the skin, with only a few capillaries spurting onto the glistening, twitching abdominal muscles. At the same time, I noticed that the laughter and shouting from the heads had been switched off, and was replaced by an eerie silence broken only by a heavy thudding sound from behind me. "Forceps, please," I said, extending my hand back, but nothing happened. I looked round. The top of the half-door was bare, not a head in sight. There was only the Viking spread-eagled in the middle of the floor, arms and legs flung wide, chin pointing to the roof. The attitude was so theatrical that I thought he was still acting the fool, but a closer examination erased all doubts. The Viking was out cold. He must have gone straight over backwards like a stricken oak. The farmer, a bent little man who couldn't have scaled much more than 8 stones, had been steadying the cow's head. He looked at me with the faintest flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Looks like you and me for it, then, governor." He tied the halter to a ring on the wall, washed his hands methodically, and took up his place at my side. Throughout the operation, he passed me my instruments, swabbed away the seeping blood, and clipped the sutures, whistling tunelessly through his teeth in a bored manner. The only time he showed any real emotion was when I produced the offending nail from the depths of the reticulum. He raised his eyebrows slightly, said "hello, hello," then started whistling again. We were too busy to do anything for the Viking. Halfway through he sat up, shook himself a few times, then got to his feet and strolled with elaborate nonchalance out of the box. The poor fellow seemed to be hoping that perhaps we had noticed nothing unusual. I don't suppose we could have done much to bring him round anyway. There was only one time I discovered a means of immediate resuscitation, and that was by accident. It was when Henry Dixon asked me to show him how to castrate a ruptured pig without leaving a swelling. Henry was going in for pigs in a big way, and had a burning ambition to equip himself with veterinary skills. When he showed me the young pig with the gross scrotal swelling, I demurred, "I really think this is a vet's job, Henry. Castrate your normal pigs by all means, but I don't think you could make a proper job of this sort of thing." "How's that, then?" "Well, there's the local anaesthetic, danger of infection, and you really need a knowledge of anatomy to know what you're doing." All the frustrated surgeon in Henry showed in his eyes. "Go, I'd like to know how to do it." "I'll tell you what," I said. "How about if I do this one as a demonstration, and you can make up your own mind? I'll give him a general anaesthetic so you don't have to hold him." "Right, that's a good idea." Henry thought for a moment. "What'll you charge me to do him?" 7 and 6. "Well, I suppose you have to have your pound of flesh. Get on." I injected a few cc's of nembutal into the little pig's peritoneum, and after some staggering he rolled over in the straw and lay still. Henry had rigged up a table in the yard, and we laid the sleeping animal on it. I was preparing to start when Henry pulled out a 10-shilling note. "Better pay you now before I forget." All right, but my hands are clean now. Push it into my pocket, and I'll give you the change when we finish. I rather fancied myself as a teacher, and soon warmed to my task. I carefully incised the skin over the inguinal canal and pulled out the testicle, intact in its tunics. See there, Henry, the bowels have come down the canal and align in with the testicle. I pointed to the loops of intestine, pale pink through the translucent membranes. Now, if I do this, I can push them right back into the abdomen, and if I press here, out they pop again. You see how it works? There, they've gone. Now they're out again. Once more, I make them disappear, and whoops, there they are, back with us. Now, in order to retain them permanently in the abdomen, I take the spermatic cord and wind it in its coverings, tightly down to the... But my audience was no longer with me. Henry had sunk down on an upturned oil drum and lay slumped across the table, his head cradled on his arms. My disappointment was acute, and finishing off the job and inserting the suitors was a sad anticlimax with my student slumbering at the end of the table. I put the pig back in his pen and gathered up my gear. Then I remembered I hadn't given Henry his change. I don't know why I did it, but instead of half a crown, I slapped down 1 shilling and 6pence on the wood a few inches from his face. The noise made him open his eyes, and he gazed dully at the coins for a few seconds. Then, with almost frightened suddenness, he snapped upright, ashen-faced, but alert and glaring. "Hey!" he shouted. "I want another shilling."